So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. I will focus on the Middle East only because it's the part of the world that I know best, and I feel I can speak about with a level of authority that I think is important to have when one is making a value judgment about the efficacy and kind of moral resonance of activist artifacts. And what I'd like to do is position this as part of my own transition from one project to another. So the first thing I will talk to you about a little bit is from my previous project, a book that was published in 2010, where I looked at a variety of culture wars going on in Arab countries around reality television. And one of the arguments I made in the book is that there was an interesting, relatively new kind of activism that emerged in that period in Arab states that made an interesting combination of a variety of existing media, from posters and newspapers to television to mobile phones. And unlike what some people are writing about now, about 2005, Twitter was not invented yet. I think there's a kind of presentism where we interpret the past decade through the prism of last week, and some pretty embarrassing mistakes are made. But what I'd like to talk about is one question, which is we're all interested in the kind of attention economy. How do you attract attention? When I'm looking at the videos coming out of the Syrian revolution, at some point there were several thousand videos coming out every day. Why is it that only a dozen are memorable? And why is it that only less than a dozen go viral and define moments, define episodes in the revolution? So that's one of the questions that I'm very interested in the current book I'm working on. The current book is called Creative Insurgency, and it's not a concept that I invented or I claim to have invented. But I'm basically looking at the interplay between style and politics in the Arab uprising. In other words, what kind of stylistic, symbolic, semiotic, aesthetic devices have activists used to attract attention in an environment of complete information saturation, right? And so this is the big question of the book. And one of my main arguments is one of the ways you attract attention in parts of the world that I call, there are two kinds of countries. I mean, we can think of the world in two kinds of countries. Those who have pretty established, comfortable sovereignty, and those who don't, right? And in spaces of the world where external actors are as important as domestic politics, all activists always have, at least all of the activists I've talked to, always have two audiences in mind. They have a local domestic audience, and they have an audience that matters in perhaps more powerful ways, which is the audience of global decision makers, which is Washington and London and Paris. And depending what episode of contention you are in changes the way you think of who your main audience is. So I don't want to speak too much. I want to show a few things. So this is a picture that at first glance probably means nothing, absolutely nothing to you. This was from the so-called Cedar Revolution in Beirut in 2005. And the local name of the Cedar Revolution was the Independence Intifada. And this is one example in which even an uprising, a revolution, an act of political defiance is named. In the US, because somehow the US government back then supported the efforts of these activists, but did not like the word Intifada because it connotes sympathy to the Palestinians, decided to call it the Cedar Revolution. And so just in the name, you see that there's already contention on how to define the event. What was very interesting about this is from March 14, 2005. So the story was that in mid-February, a Lebanese statesman was assassinated. A previous prime minister was assassinated in Beirut. And within a few days, hundreds of thousands of activists gathered in downtown Beirut, accusing the Syrians, who back then controlled Lebanon and basically occupied most of the country militarily, of having killed him. What the Syrians had done in the previous month was to extend by fiat the tenure of the president of the Lebanese Republic. Now, one of the peculiarities of Lebanese politics is that, with very few exceptions, power changes every 6 years. The person at the helm leaves. There are elections. They're not It's not universal suffrage, it's parliamentary election that decide the next president. But most presidents have the temptation of staying in power and try to find ways to extend it. In this case, the Syrians wanted to keep the president, Mr. Lahoud, whose name is at the top of that banner, because he was a very faithful partner or servant, depending on how you saw him. Now, one of the interesting things that was going on in the Middle East at the same time was the wave of reality TV shows. You've watched them, you've heard about them, you might hate them, you might love them. The interesting thing is they have a very basic premise, which is that they feature a variety of contestants who can dance or sing or outdo each other at being nasty or whatever it is that they do. And then once a week, the public, the audience votes, and somebody's kicked out of the house, of the island, of whatever wacko place it is, depending on the show. And at the end, a winner is crowned. Now, those shows were all the rage in the Middle East back then. And so one of the things that these protesters were trying to do is to convey a very important, complicated political message in very simple terms. In terms, as they told me, that would be meaningful to the local teenager as they would be meaningful to somebody like Dan Rather. And that would end up on newscasts all over the world. So how do we do this? Well, this is a very simple handmade banner. And it basically features the President of the Republic, whose term was extended by force by the Syrians, as a nominee in a reality show to be voted out of the island. And so he's it's his name, it's nominee, and then it says call 1559. Now, in these reality shows, typically there's a number that you can call, send a text to, or call to vote. Now, so in the Arab world, these numbers are typically 4 digits. The interesting thing about this is that anybody who's from the region knows exactly what 1559 refers to. 1559 was United Nations Security Council Resolution number 1559 that called for the withdrawal of all foreign troops from Lebanon. And so what they did is they basically called on the UN resolution to be implemented, which meant basically that the Syrian army had to leave Lebanon, in which case the president would fall and would be kicked out the island. Now, they summarized all this kind of geopolitical story that unfolded over a period of 6 months in one all you need is basically a marker and a piece of cardboard. And that message resonated. Everybody you talked to had seen it, had understood it, knew exactly what it meant. There are examples in the global media of journalists attempting to explain this. Once you see the visual, you can explain it in 3 or 4 sentences. Without the visual, you probably need 2 or 3 pages, and you would lose people's attention. So this is one example of a trend that I noticed, which is what I'm focusing on today, which is that for a local political message to be resonant, you have to graft it on a global form that people will understand. What these activists felt is that since reality TV was popular not only in the Middle East but globally, this was a way for them to make a message understandable, legible, discernible, comprehensible to multiple audiences at the same time. And this is a trend that I've noticed as I'm working on my new project. A year ago, I returned from 13 months in the Middle East, basically doing field research, traveling, interviewing activists, taking pictures of graffiti, seeing what people are watching in coffee shops and what they're doing in back alleys at night, which is usually painting things on walls. And this is a trend that seems to be confirming itself over and over and over again, which is, if you want your message to be heard, and to be politically effective, you have to make it simultaneously understandable to a local audience and to a global audience. Now, let me show you a few more examples. Now, this is from you might have seen this. These have circulated widely in the West. Foreign Policy magazine had a piece about them. This is a town in Syria, Kafar Nabal, whose inhabitants had this very peculiar proclivity to create these posters in Arabic and in English that mocked the Syrian president, the dictator, and that also used tropes from global popular culture to make themselves understood. They called their town occupied Kfar Nabal because it was occupied by their own regular standing army, right, which they considered to be illegitimate. And this is Bashar al-Assad as featured in The Lord of the Thrones, which is a way, again, to play up local politics on a global theme. This scene, you probably, anyone in doubt which movie this comes from or inspired by? Right? So this is the final scene in Titanic, right? When DiCaprio and Blanchett are just about to take the deep dive in the frozen ocean. And this is, of course, Bashar al-Assad playing Kate Blanchett's role, and Vladimir Putin playing DiCaprio, basically saying that Syria, with the regime, with the help of the Russians, is sinking Syria, right? Very powerful, from the same town, again, colored cardboard and color pens. Very simple message, and yet quite resonant, because it does couple a local political theme on a globally understandable form of culture, of popular culture, in this case, a Hollywood blockbuster. This, again, occupied Kfar Nabil. It's written in Arabic, the two words at the bottom. And basically, they are mocking the father of Bashar al-Assad, who died a decade ago, or more, who basically, when people tried to make the argument that the son was different from the father, the son was going to open up and do all these good things. And this basically confirms the notion that no, it's not the case. There's the godfather and there's a chip of the old block. Again, local politics articulated to a globally resonant form of popular culture. Who hasn't watched The Godfather? Probably more Arabs have watched The Godfather than Americans, in my experience. So again, these messages work very, very well. Now, so these are basic color and cardboard messages. One of the things I realized is that the medium, one of the media of choice in the Arab revolutions is video. Video has become, as you know, quite cheap to produce. It circulates very well. It seems to have become a universal form. One of the things, I was writing an essay about video. You know, if you go on NPR's website now, there are videos. If you go read an article on the New York Times, with the migration of all media online, video has become one of the primary ways to attract attention. I mean, it's a big, think of the irony that the press and radio now need video to survive, basically. And so as I started looking at the kinds of videos that were emerging, I did my research very, very, very scientifically, which is walking around in the cafes of Beirut and Cairo and see what people are watching on their mobile phones and on their laptops. And one of the videos that I encountered early on turned out to have become probably one of the most viral videos from the Syrian revolution. Let me show it to you, and then we can talk about it.
أنا مالي مجنون. أنا مالي مجنون. أنا مالي مجنون، مالي مجنون، أنا مالي مجنون.
يا مدحة يا محلاها الحرية،
يا محلاها الحرية، يا محلاها الحرية،
ويا محلاها الحرية،
وسوريا نادت فيا، رب السما محيية، سوريا ردوها عليا، يا محلاها الحرية،
سوريا حرية
وشامينا لا تهتمي، بديك بروحي دير الزرق
مندر
يلا يا الحرية، يا محلاها الحرية، وطق وموت وبعصية، والأسد بعد الشرعية، راحت المحسوبية بثورتنا السلمية، يا محلاها الحرية، يا محلاها الحرية. أعزائي المشاهدين، مع برنامجكم اليوم من سيقتل المليون. بنحب نذكر بالحلقة القادمة كان معنا المتسابق حسني مبارك اللي حصل على 3000 قتيل، وبالمقابل كان معنا المتسابق الثاني طبعا معمر القذافي اللي وصل ل 20,000 قتيل. اليوم معنا متسابق توقعات كلها عم تقول هو الذي سيقتل المليون، المتسابق بشار الأسد من سوريا. شلون المعنويات؟ ممتازة. نبلش بالسؤال الأول. لو أردت أن ترتكب مجزرة في دمشق العاصمة من ستكلف بها؟ ماهر الأسد، رامي مخلوف، آصف شوكت، علي مملوك. سؤال سخيف صراحة، لأنني سأكلف أخي ماهر السفاح طبعا، لأن أخي ماهر صاحب خبرة، فأنت رأيت ما فعل في درعا في بداية الأحداث، وهو صاحب مجزرة صيدنايا.
جواب نهائي؟
طبعا أنا واثق.
يأسفني إلا جوابك صحيح. 7,000
قتيل وبحب الناس الخايع اللي بتقتل على طول، اما اللي عم يتظاهر ماليش ابدا بدون. السؤال الثاني، لنشوف شلون المعنويات.
المعنويات جدا 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 ممتازة.
طيب، من هو أغبى شخص في نظامك؟ طالب إبراهيم، بسام أبو عبد الله، خالد عبود الملقب بالدوائر والمربعات، أو الجميع أغبياء؟
حسنا. هلا بما انك ما ذكرت وسينة شعبان فاصبح الجواب سهل، الجميع اغبياء.
جواب نهائي؟
طبعا.
بيأسفني اقول لك انه جوابك صحيح، وصار معك 3000 قتيل.
شكرا يا جورج، دائما انت مواقفك مشرفة مع نظامنا.
وهلا منروح قبل السؤال الثالث للعلام.
يلي بيطالب بالحرية برحيل الأم الأسدية يبقى الواد ده إيه؟
جرثومة.
يبقى الواد ده إيه؟
جرثومة.
ديتول قاتل الجراثيم برعاية سوريا تيل.
السؤال التالي، نعم، هل ستستطيع قمع المظاهرات أو الثورة السورية؟ نعم. لا. ممكن غص من على الراس الكل.
حسنا، اريد ان استعين بصديق.
ليش ضل لك أصدقاء؟
ايه صح، انا ما ضل لي اصدقاء، بس يعني انا بقدر جاوب لحالي، مالي مضطر للاصدقاء اساسا. انا بقول انه الجواب سهل. سأستطيع أن أقمع جميع المظاهرات غص من على راس الكل.
جواب نهائي؟
نهائي؟
جواب نهائي؟
ايه نهائي؟
متأكد؟
ايه طبعا متأكد.
جوابك خطأ. جوابك خطأ. أعزائي المشاهدين، سؤال الحلقة القادمة لمن يود الاشتراك في برنامجنا هو: أين ستبدأ المظاهرات بعد أن يرحل النظام السوري؟ إيران؟ السعودية؟ الجزائر؟ سويسرا؟ للتصويت كونوا معنا على موقعنا الإلكتروني www.massافتمتي.com.
يلعن شرفك على شرف البرنامج. يلعن شرفك على شرف البرنامج. هلا صلحوها يا لعيبة يا خريبة.
So this was, this is four people who, yeah, if we could just kill the volume. Two of them were theater students in Damascus. And it was a collective of four who was born during the uprising. They started doing this in a basement. These are finger puppets they created themselves. When the two actors showed up, you kind of got a sense of the scale, right? And they were shot basically using a basic camera, and in some episodes were shot on a flashlight, because there was no electrical power. They would have had a couple of spare batteries on the camera, and they did it. Then the regime started trying to catch them. They ended up, half of them in Beirut, half in Cairo. And then they split because two of them supported the Free Syrian Army. The two others are committed pacifists, and they said, we don't condone violence, that's why we're doing this. And the group fell apart. They tried to raise funds for the second season on Kickstarter. Their campaign failed. The Prince Claus Fund of the Netherlands, it's an endowment in the Netherlands that supports artists at risk, funded the second season, and then the third one never happened. The bottom line with this is a very low-cost, high-impact type of activism. Why? So for the local audiences, when you have the lists of names, these are basically the assistants of the dictator. One is his brother, another one is the head of the police, basically the top goons, which itself is a play on Top Gun, which was also amazingly popular in the Middle East whenever Tom Cruise was 18 or 20. So one of the interesting things, though, is that even if you don't understand really the content, the minutiae of the details, you get the point. here's a dictator who begins by self-incriminating, right? It's my brother, he has an experience in massacres, his isolation is shown. No, I don't have any friends, but I don't care. All the way at the end to show that, all the promises of reform were basically bogus, and that on top of it, he's a sore loser, right, at the very end. This kind of stuff is very effective because it creates a narrative that, number one, expresses the tragedy that Syrians are going through, but also makes them laugh at the dictator. And I don't want to go into detail, but you probably are all aware of the role of political humor in kind of deflating the grandiosity of power and minimizing the impact of tyranny on people. Other episodes are, you have some that are very dark. One of them is called The Interrogation, that shows an activist being tortured and interrogated. Another one is hilarious. It shows Bashar's own kids demonstrating in their living room and asking for the fall of the regime. So he's facing the protests in his own home. The bottom line is this, the reason this is so effective, number one, it's very easy to produce. They created YouTube channels. It's their own subtitling in English, so they control the message completely. And within a couple of weeks after the first few episodes were online, they became the darlings of the international media. They got written up everywhere from Der Spiegel to Le Monde to the New York Times, and they achieved global fame. Now the question is, what did this lead to? My answer is it's too early to tell. Right? We always want to know what the impact is immediately. I think an interesting question in this case is, was this really used as the kind of activist visuals that would attract new followers, new adherents to the cause, or was it rather in very dark times when activists were dying on a daily basis in Syria, did it really just mobilize and nurture their commitment to the cause? So was it really preaching to the choir and keeping the choir together, keeping the choir from falling apart under the pressures of torture and shootings and displacement and exile and all the death and fire and violence of the revolution? Or was it rather a message to the world, which is, this is our cause? And I would argue, I think the more fundamental role that this played was the first one. But at the same time, because they play on this register of two audiences at all times in every single episode, it does serve both purposes. So I'll stop here. Maybe we have a